Ok, muy buen día. Mi nombre es Luis Gutiérrez, profesor del Instituto de Ciencias Físicas y Matemáticas de la Universidad Austral y integrante del comité organizador local. Como parte de como comité, tenemos el gusto de tenerlo aquí en nuestra universidad, así que reciban primeramente la más cordial bienvenida. Muchísimas gracias por estar acá. Cuando se nos encomendó esta tarea en 2017, hubo ciertamente inquietud, nerviosismo, empezaron a fluir las expectativas que teníamos de organizar un evento así, así que esperamos haber cumplido con parte de ellas, pero para trabajar esa inquietud de expectativas que teníamos, lo único que hicimos fue trabajar y hicimos nuestro mejor esfuerzo en pos de que esta versión 2018 sea lo mejor posible. En este sentido, quería agradecer el enorme trabajo de los coordinadores de sesiones por todo el tiempo que invirtieron, por la cantidad de correos que recibieron, por la cantidad de correos que tuvieron que responder también. También agradecer a los conferencistas plenarios que al recibir la invitación a visitarnos accedieron feliz y gratamente a venir a estar con nosotros y darnos una conferencia, así que muchas gracias también a ellos. Estamos, por último, muy felices también del interés en participar de parte de los estudiantes. Recibimos una gran cantidad de solicitudes de apoyo a asistir al Congreso, así que hicimos lo que más se pudo en ese sentido también. Así que muchas gracias a todos por venir y cuenten con nosotros para cualquier cosa que podamos ayudar en pos de que esta jornada sea lo mejor posible. Bueno, y por último tengo el gusto de presentar a la doctora Sinem Obadasi del Instituto de Ciencias Físicas y Matemáticas de la Universidad Austral, que nos presentarán nuestra primera charla plenaria. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, primero a mí también me gustaría decir que estás bienvenidos y espero que es primera charla plenaria. Espero que tenemos todo vaya muy bien. Bueno, primera charla plenaria es de Lidia Hügel. Es invitado de álgebra, trabaja mucho de álgebra homológica en varias áreas de álgebra homológica, sobre todo en teoría de representación. Y hay que decir también sobre ella que es fundador del grupo de investigación en Verona, el grupo de teoría de representación, y ese grupo es un grupo destacado en Europa. Por eso es un honor presentar a ella, sobre todo siendo un miembro del grupo de álgebra en la Universidad Austral de Chile. Y Lidia Hügel, de la Universidad de Verona, nos va a hablar de Comparing Localization of Rings.
Hola, buenos días. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Es un placer y un honor hablar en este congreso. Y voy a pedir, como sentís, no hablo muy bien español, entonces preferiría hablar en inglés, si no es un problema para vosotros. Pero las preguntas, si tenéis preguntas, pueden ser en español. No hay problema. ¿Pueden escucharme así o tengo que encender el micrófono? ¿Se escucha bien? Now, can you hear me? Now, I think now you can. Well, so now let me start. So the title of my talk is Comparing Localization of Rings. And I will start explaining a little bit what the philosophy in representation theory of algebras is. So we start with a ring, and we want to study, to understand the ring in terms of its modules. The modules of this ring, they form a category of modules. And the modules are what we call the representations of R. So we study R in terms of its representations. Let me recall what a module is. A module is an abelian group where you have a scalar multiplication and the scalars are taken from the ring. And you have some compatibility rules between the different operations. And then the maps that you look at, the homomorphisms, are linear maps. So it's the same axioms that you know from linear algebra, so vector spaces, with the only difference that you are taking scalars from a ring instead of a field. If the ring happens to be a field, then you get just the usual vector spaces. If the ring is, for example, the integers, then you get abelian groups. But then there are many, many more rings and many more modules and many more complicated situations that you can study in this context. So the fact that the scalars are coming from a ring instead of a field makes things more complicated because it implies that modules in general don't have a basis. Modules having a basis are called free modules. And they are precisely, up to isomorphism, direct sums of copies of the ring, like in a vector space, direct sums of copies of the field. Here you have direct sums of copies of the ring with some cardinality. And then you can look at their direct summons. They are called projective. They don't need to have a basis, so you lose this property of having a basis when you pass the direct summand. But still, these projective modules are distinguished. They play an important role. They are the basis, they are the essential ingredient to start doing homological algebra. And because they are so important, I introduce a notation. So we denote by proj R the finitely generated projective modules. It means these are the direct summands of finite direct sums of copies of the ring. Okay, so now what do we want to do? We want to study, as I said, a ring in terms of its representations. And what happens if we take a ring homomorphism? Then a ring homomorphism gives rise to a subcategory of the category of all modules via something that we call restriction of scalars. So if you think for a moment what happens if you start with a module, an S module, a module over the ring S, then of course you have also a scalar multiplication with scalars from R, because you can carry scalars from R to S via this lambda. That's the restriction of scalars. Then you can view any S module also as an R module. Now the problem, let's go back for a moment. The problem is that in general, so now you take two S modules and you look at the S linear maps. They are also R linear maps, but in general there can be more R linear maps. Now we are interested in the case where the maps are the same. R linear maps and S linear maps are the same. In categorical terms, this is this property. We ask that this functor is full. And that can be, again, expressed, it's equivalent to asking that our ring homomorphism is an epimorphism in a categorical sense. And then we call our homomorphism a ring epimorphism. These are the homomorphisms that we are interested in because then we have a full control on the maps. We know the maps. Okay. Examples. So, of course, first example of a ring epimorphism is a surjective ring homomorphism. This is certainly a ring epimorphism. But then there are many more examples which need not be surjective, and the prototype is this one. You take the embedding of the integers in the rationals. This is a ring homomorphism, and of course, if you take a Q vector space and you take a map which is, you take two Q vector spaces and a map which is linear with respect to the integers, then it will be linear also with respect to the rationals. So this is really a ring. The homomorphisms are the same, and therefore this is a ring epimorphism. More generally, rings of fractions. So what are we doing here? We are constructing, we're starting with a ring, and we are constructing a new ring where we want to invert certain elements. So we start with a multiplicative system. So we start with elements from R, a subset of elements of R, which is closed under multiplication and contains the identity element. And now we want to invert these elements. How to do that? It's a construction that you probably know. You form fractions. I mean, you certainly know it because it's what you do when you pass from Z to Q. Yeah. So you form fractions, and of course you have to take into account the fact that you have to take into account the fact that if you have a fraction and you multiply the denominator and the numerator with the same element, then the fraction doesn't change. And that's this equivalence relation that we are taking here. So in this way, we get a new ring, and we also get a homomorphism from the old ring to the new one, just by sending an element to its fraction divided by 1. That's exactly what you do here, when you embed the integers into the rationals. But in general, here you get an injective map. In general, this map won't be injective, because what can happen is that you have an element from sigma that annihilates your A. Yeah, that's something that doesn't happen in vector spaces, but happens in modules and in rings. So you can have this, and then you see that this fraction will become 0. And so these are the elements that we call torsion elements. They become 0 when you form the fraction. Yeah, this, what I was explaining, works for commutative rings. If you have non-commutative rings, then things are a bit more delicate, but there is a theory developed called Euler localization for the non-commutative case. Now let's be a bit more general. And instead of inverting elements, let's invert matrices. What is a matrix? Remember from linear algebra, a matrix is a map between n copies of R and m copies of R. Yeah, so it's a map between finitely generated free modules. And more generally, we can invert not only these maps, but also maps between finitely generated projective modules. That's the notion of universal localization. And let me say a few words on the construction. The construction, again, is by generators and relations. So what we do is we take a matrix that we want to invert, and we adjoin elements, and we impose some relations in such a way that when we multiply our original matrix with a new matrix that we have constructed, we get the unit matrix, and of the right size, depending on whether you multiply on the left or on the right. And in both cases, in this case and in the rings of fractions that we saw before, what we get is something that we call universal sigma inverting, because what we are doing, we are inverting the elements of sigma in a universal way. That means that there is a universal property, and this universal property makes the construction unique. So this ring that we are constructing is unique up to isomorphism, thanks to this universal property. So these are examples of ring epimorphisms that will play a role. And now let's go back to our prototype example, the embedding of the integers in the rationals. Now, I have already told you that via restriction of scalars, every Q module becomes a module over the integers, can be viewed as a module over the integers. But we can go also in the reverse direction. We can start with an abelian group, a module over the integers, and construct a module over the rationals, again by taking fractions. And again, it can happen that a fraction becomes 0 if you start with a torsion element. If you start with an element which is annihilated by some non-zero integer, then your fraction will become 0. And if you start with an abelian group where all elements are torsion elements, such a group is called a torsion group, then the whole construction will collapse, and this will be 0. Yeah, and yeah, I forgot to say that these fractions that we form, this set of fractions that we form, can be also described by the tensor product, by tensoring M with the rationals. Okay, so that's the first possibility that we have when we want to go back. We start with a module here and we want to get a module here. Second possibility is instead of tensoring, we take homomorphisms. We take all maps, all z-linear maps from the rationals to M, and this is going to be an abelian group which has a scalar multiplication, so it's again a Q module. What you see here in this example can be done in general. You can take any ring epimorphism, and then you can take the restriction of scalars, which embeds the S modules into the R modules, and you have always two functors going in the opposite direction. The one is given by tensoring, the other is given by taking homomorphisms, and these two functors are adjoints. So I'm not going to, let us go back for a moment. Are adjoints? Oh. No? What did I do? Here. So the upper functor is left adjoint and the lower functor is right adjoint. If you don't know what adjoint functors are, it's not important. The important thing is that you know that there is a tight connection between mod S and mod R thanks to these functors that allows to carry information from one side to the other. Okay, so now what we get now is, so we call a subcategory with this property such that the inclusion functor has a left adjoint and a right adjoint, we call it bireflective. So what we have just seen is that when you start with a ring epimorphism, you can assign to it a bireflective subcategory of mod R. The bireflective subcategory is just mod S, the modules over S. They form a bireflective subcategory, a subcategory with this nice property. And of course, I'm writing here that there is a bijection. So if you want to get an injection, you will have to identify ring epimorphisms that give rise to the same bireflective subcategory. That can be characterized by saying these are ring epimorphisms, two ring epimorphisms will give rise to the same subcategory if they factor one factors through the other via an isomorphism. And that's the equivalence relation that we impose here. So in this way we get an injective map, and it turns out that this map is also surjective. So we have a bijection. Okay, now let's push this a little bit further. So now we start with a ring epimorphism which has a very nice property. It's called a flat ring epimorphism. That means that this restriction of, that the left adjoint of the restriction of scalars, this tensor functor, is exact. In general, this functor is not exact. Here we ask that it is exact, which means precisely that it carries injective maps to injective maps. When you have this situation, then you can do much better than before. So you get something which is called a récollement. So you have again these three functors with adjointness, but not only on the level of modules, you have it also on the level of the derived category. I'm not going to explain what the derived category is because this would carry us too far. But the point again is that you have, this shows that you have a very tight link between mod S and mod R, not only at module level, but also that you can carry homological information from one side to the other. So they are really very, very closely connected. And you have also this right-hand side here. You have a third category which you can use to understand the relationship between the categories. Well, let's look at examples again. So when we have our prototype, the integers into the rationals, this indeed is a flat ring epimorphism, so we have such a récollement. And here the third category is given by the torsion groups that I was mentioning before. More generally, if you have a ring of fractions, again, this is a flat ring epimorphism, so you have this tight connection. If you have a universal localization, this was, remember, when we invert not just elements but matrices or maps between projective modules, then this is not flat in general. We will see an example at the end of the talk. But it still has a very nice property. It is what we call pseudo-flat. Let me explain what this means. So let's go back to flat. Flat can be described by a homological functor called Tor, and it means that precisely that Tor of S with all other modules vanishes. Now we will ask a bit less. We will ask that Tor of S with itself vanishes, and that's pseudo-flat. That's what we call pseudo-flat. Of course, it's much weaker, but it is still useful and interesting because you have this theorem, namely, recall that we had this bijection between ring epimorphisms and bireflective subcategories. Now this restricts to a bijection between pseudo-flat ring epimorphisms and bireflective extension-closed subcategories. What does extension-closed mean? Think of the situation where you have a module, and this has a submodule which is in your category, and the corresponding quotient is also in the category. Then extension closed means that then in this case, your module will be in the category. So if you have a submodule which is in the category and the quotient is in the category, then the module is in the category. And this property corresponds to pseudo-flat. And that's satisfied by universal localizations. Yeah, so let's summarize what we saw. We saw that there are some ways of constructing ring epimorphisms, and so the most classical one is this one, rings of fractions. And rings of fractions are special instances of universal localizations because, of course, elements are matrices, are very small matrices. And we saw that universal localizations are special instances of pseudo-flat ring epimorphisms. And now the question we want to address is this, the converse. Can we go back? When can we go back? Why is this question interesting? For example, you can view it from the point of view of representation theory. This would be, say, the ring theoretic question. Now the representation theoretic question would say, if I start with a bireflective extension closed subcategory, so one that corresponds to pseudo-flat, does it come from a universal localization? So is it determined by maps between projective modules? Or even better, does it come from a ring of fractions? Is it determined by elements? Yeah, that's the representation theory question that we are asking. And we want to discuss this question in three special cases where we have answers, namely commutative Noetherian rings, hereditary rings, and finite dimensional algebras. These are the cases that we are going to look at. Yeah, let's start with commutative Noetherian rings. Right? Let me remind you, the ring is commutative, so the multiplication is commutative, and Noetherian means that ideals, all ideals, are finitely generated. So if we have such a ring, then we have a lot of tools at our disposal. These are rings that play a role in algebraic geometry, and we have a lot of things that we can use. For example, we have a topological space called the Zariski spectrum, where the points are the prime ideals of the ring, and the closed sets are of this form. They consist of the, so a set is closed if it consists of all prime ideals that lie over certain ideal. And we will need also these sets, unions of closed sets, and these are usually called specialization closed subsets. They will play a role later. So remember, when you have a prime ideal, what you can do is form the ring of fractions. The ring of fractions where you are inverting the elements that are not contained in this prime ideal. This is called the localization at P. It's denoted in this way. And then, as we saw before, it's a special case of what we saw before. When you have a module, you can pass to the corresponding RP module, taking fractions. And when you have a map, you can pass to the corresponding map. Again, tensoring, using the tensor product or working with fractions, depending on what you prefer. Okay, so now an important role will be played by a special abelian group that is studied in algebraic geometry. It's called the Picard group. Its elements are invertible modules, or isomorphism classes of invertible modules. What does it mean that a module is invertible? A module is invertible if it is finitely generated projective, and it has the property that whenever you localize it, you get the ring localized at P. So you get a free module and a very special one, the ring itself. That's the notion of invertible module. And these invertible modules are very nice. I'll show you why. Because you have some nice properties, some closure properties. If you have two invertible modules, then you tensor them, and the result is again invertible. Then you take the R dual, and the result is again invertible. And then, if you take a module, an invertible module, and tensor it with its own R dual, you get back the ring. So this allows to introduce a group structure on the isomorphism classes of invertible modules, where the multiplication is given by the tensor product, and the identity element is the isomorphism class of R. Then you see here that this is the inverse element of P. And this group is called the Picard group. Yeah. Now let's look again at the question. I remind you of the question. So we want to look at the relationship between these notions, or these constructions: rings of fractions, universal localization, pseudo-flat. And now we look at this. We look at this, whether we can go back here. And a first answer is given by this result, which says that if the Picard group is torsion, remember what torsion meant. Torsion meant that all elements are torsion elements. So all elements are annihilated by some integer. Okay, so if the Picard group is torsion, then every universal localization is a ring of fractions. Then these two notions coincide. These two constructions are the same. Okay, that's the first answer. Now we look at this implication. Can we go back here? When can we go back here? And here, in the commutative Noetherian case, there is a very nice fact, namely that in that case, pseudo-flat is the same as flat. Okay, so, and also, whenever you have a pseudo-flat ring epimorphism, here you start with a commutative Noetherian ring, then this will be again commutative Noetherian. So we stay in the commutative Noetherian world in this situation. Furthermore, if we have a flat ring epimorphism, then we can assign to it a specialization closed subset. This was a union of closed subsets in a very natural way, because remember I showed you at the beginning that flat ring epimorphisms induce these recollements, this diagram of functors that I showed you, and recollements are known to be in bijection with specialization closed subsets. This is work of Gabriel and Niemann. And therefore, in this way, we can assign to every flat ring epimorphism a specialization closed subset. So we can study the flat ring epimorphism in terms of prime ideals. And in general, there are many more specialization closed subsets as flat ring epimorphisms than flat ring epimorphisms. But now we're going to see a case where things are much nicer. And that's the following case. Assume that your ring is commutative Noetherian and that it has cruel dimension at most 1. What is cruel dimension? Cruel dimension is a measure of the length of chains of prime ideals. So cruel dimension 1 means that chains are at most of length 1. So every prime ideal contains at most one prime ideal below. There are no longer chains. If you are in this situation, then you know that you can prove that every flat ring epimorphism is a universal localization. So we have equality here. We can go back. And moreover, we can prove that the universal localizations, or the flat ring epimorphisms, it's the same, are in bijection with the recollements, are in bijections with subsets, or specialization closed subsets of the Zariski spectrum. Okay, so that's another answer. And let me tell you that there are other cases where we know that these this result holds true, which can be cases that can be described again by looking at certain abelian groups. I'm not going into detail here, but looking at whether certain abelian groups are torsion. This plays an important role. But there are counterexamples already in Krull dimension 2. So Krull dimension 1 is nice, but already when you move to the next step, Krull dimension 2, things can be very nasty. Okay, let's look now at an example. An example of a very nice commutative Noetherian rings of Krull dimension 1. These are Dedekind domains. These are rings that occur in algebraic geometry and in algebraic number theory. For example, the ring of algebraic integers in a number field is always a Dedekind domain. And the definition says it's a domain. So domain means if you take two non-zero elements and you multiply them, the result will be non-zero. So there are few, in the ring there are no torsion elements. And an integral domain for which all ideals are invertible. In particular, all ideals are projective. Okay, so that's Noetherian of Krull dimension at most 1. And the Picard group in this case is well known. It's what is studied in number theory. It's called the ideal class group. And here one knows that every flat ring epimorphism is a universal localization, of course, because it has Krull dimension 1, but even more, it occurs here. It is situated between R and its quotient field. So it has always this form. And we know by the other result I was telling before that flat ring epimorphisms are ring of fractions if and only if the Picard group, so the ideal class group in this case, is torsion. These things were known. In this special case, these things were known from the 60s. And now let's look at some more concrete examples. Take a ring of algebraic integers in a number field, for example, this one. And then it's known, it's an important theorem in algebraic number theory, that the Picard group, the ideal class group, is finite, and therefore it's torsion. Okay, so in this case, this is the nice case where universal localization or flat ring epimorphisms are precisely rings of fractions. But it's not always that nice, because it's known, again, classical result from the 60s, that every abelian group can be the ideal class group of some Dedekind domain. So you can take an abelian group which is not torsion, for example, the integers themselves. And then you will find a Dedekind domain which has a non-torsion Picard group, so therefore you will find universal localizations which are not rings of fractions. Okay. Let's go a bit further now, and now let's leave the commutative world, and we look at hereditary rings. So these are rings that are not necessarily commutative, where we impose the condition that right and left ideals. So now, because the ring is not commutative, I have to distinguish between left and right ideals, but I want them all to be projective. So we can phrase it in this way: the global dimension is at most 1. So instead of Krull dimension we were looking at before, now we take global dimension at most 1. And still this condition is quite strong, and it entails that things are quite nice. Namely, again, we have that in this case pseudo-flat ring epimorphisms coincide with universal localizations, and that the universal localizations are in bijection with the regoulements. So the same things that we saw in Krull dimension 1 hold here. Okay, now let's move to finite dimensional algebras. That's in fact my home, the area where I'm mainly working. Finite dimensional algebras. So this is, what does it mean? So I'm taking a ring which has also a structure of a vector space over some field, and as a vector, and the two structures are compatible, so it's an algebra. And as a vector space over the field, it's finite dimensional. Okay, so recall the questions we are discussing. We are looking at a ring epimorphism, and we know that if it's a universal localization, it's pseudo-flat, and we want to discuss the converse, whether the converse is true. Now, things are more nasty, are not as nice as over-commutative Noetherian rings, because, first of all, universal localizations are not flat in general, and also, we leave the world of finite-dimensional algebras, because universal localizations, you can start with a finite-dimensional algebra, take its universal localization, and you will still get an algebra over the same field, but in general, it won't be finite-dimensional. Let me show you some examples in order to illustrate this. So here we take, what do we take? We construct a finite-dimensional algebra starting from an oriented graph. So here in representation theory, we call this a quiver, an oriented graph. Carcaje, no? Vale. And now, so you start with such an oriented quiver, and you can construct an algebra out of it. Let me tell you briefly how you do that. You take as elements, you take all the paths that you can form in your quiver. So here, this quiver is very small. The paths are easy. So you have this, and then you have the so-called lazy paths, where you don't move in 1, in 2, and in 3. These are all the paths you have. So the algebra will have dimension 5. So you construct this vector space, taking as a basis the paths, and then you need also multiplication because you want to have a ring, and the multiplication will be given by concatenation of paths. You compose paths. Where is it possible? If it's not possible, then the product will be 0. And in this way, you get a finite-dimensional algebra. If the quiver was finite, you will get a finite-dimensional algebra. And very much is known about these algebras, and there is a tight relationship. You can read off the quiver, you can read many properties of the algebra. For example, here, the vertices of the algebras give rise to projective modules. So these vertices 1, 2, 3 give rise to P1, P2, and P3. These are projective modules. And now we are looking at a map between these modules. This is this map sigma between this finitely generated projective module and this finitely generated projective module, and we take the universal localization. So we want to invert this map. And now I'm not entering in all these details, but the point is that you can show that the result that you will get, R sigma, and in fact any R sigma module, is a direct sum of two modules. These two modules, I1 and I3, they correspond also to the vertices and are so-called injective modules. And so R sigma will be a direct sum of copies of I1 and I3. And these two modules are definitely not projective, and therefore they are definitely not flat, because over finite dimensional algebras, flat and projective is the same. So here you have immediately a very easy example in you take a very small finite dimensional algebra, very well understood, and immediately you see that the universal localization is not flat, so there is no hope. Next example, we take the Kronecker algebra. So we do the same, play the same game, start now with this quiver, two vertices and two arrows, very few paths. And we construct again this algebra, the path algebra. And now this picture here depicts all possible universal localizations of A. And it's a lattice. You see it's depicted as a lattice because in fact it forms a lattice with respect to a certain partial order. And one knows that all these, here there are countably many universal localizations here and countably many universal localizations here, which are all finite dimensional. But then there are a lot of universal localizations here, which are all infinite dimensional. So again, you start with a very small, easy, well understood algebra, and you immediately, when you take the universal localization, you leave the world of finite dimensional algebras. So things are a bit more involved here. So since things are a bit more involved, we have to enter a more involved theory. And so now we need to use some theory, some tools. And the tools that we use is called silting theory. So now it starts to get really more algebraic and more involved. I'm sorry. And so let me try to explain what a silting complex is. So we're taking complexes of modules, and we are taking bounded complexes, so only finitely many members in your complex will be non-zero, and the members here are projective. Okay, we take such a complex, and now we say that it is a silting complex if it satisfies two properties. The first property is an orthogonality condition. We ask that there are no positive self-extensions. So concretely, this means that in the derived category, there are no maps from sigma to positive shifts of sigma. Okay, that's the first condition. The second condition, we ask that a generating condition. We ask that it is a generator. And here, of course, I'm sorry, there is a misprint, so there is something missing here. Not every complex, but every complex of this form, is constructed from sigma in a natural way. So the natural constructions that you can do in the derived category, you can shift complexes, you can extend complexes, you can take coproducts, direct sums, and direct summons. And with these constructions, starting from sigma, you will get all complexes of this form. So remember, silting, even if you don't understand the details, but silting is determined by two properties, an orthogonality condition and a generating condition. It's a notion that originates from a paper of Keller of Fossig of the late 80s. And then it re-emerged recently because of many interesting connections that I'm trying to explain on the next slides. So first of all, we will be especially interested in silting complexes, in very small silting complexes that have only two terms. And we will look at modules that arise from these complexes, namely the zero cohomologies of this complex. So we will say that the zero cohomologies of such complex are called silting modules, and you can rephrase it purely in the module category by saying that a module is silting if it has a projective presentation where this map is a silting complex. Okay, so why is this interesting? Where does it come from? So it's interesting because of several reasons. First of all, silting modules can be used to study the module category because they give rise to a decomposition of the module category in two classes that somehow give you information on the whole module category. That's a notion which is called a torsion pair. Similarly, in the derived category, every silting complex gives rise again to a decomposition which is called now a T-structure, something similar to what I was saying before. And once you have a T-structure, you can form a new abelian category out of it, which is called the heart of the T-structure. And this new abelian category is related to your original module category in a strong way, and in an even stronger way when instead of silting, you take tilting. What is tilting? It's a special instance of silting where instead of asking that there are no positive self-extensions, you ask more. You ask that there are no self-extensions whatsoever, no positive and no negative ones. Then if you are in this situation, then you even know that the derived category of your original category you started with is equivalent to the derived category of this new abelian category called the heart. So we say that the module category and the heart are derived equivalent. And this is a special instance of the Morita theory for derived categories that was developed by Rickard and other authors at the end of the 80s, which was this was a milestone in representation theory because it allowed to connect representation theory with many other areas. Because notice that this heart, in general, won't be a category of modules. It can be another abelian category example, typically it's a category originating from algebraic geometry, some geometrical object. For example, if you take the Kronecker algebra that I showed you before, these two vertices and two arrows, then it turns out that the derived, using this tilting theory, one can show that the derived category of the Kronecker algebra is the same as the derived category of quasi-coherent sheaves over the projective line. So you find a connection between algebra and geometry in this way. Yeah? And also, this is used also in topology, in algebraic topology, in stable homotopy theory, and so on. So it was a step which linked representation theory of algebras with many other areas. And that's where this tilting theory comes from. It originates from tilting theory. It's a generalization of tilting theory. Yeah, and as I said, it gained again interest in recent years because of its connection with cluster theory, because in fact it turned out that silting complexes can be used to give a categorical interpretation to some phenomena coming from cluster theory called cluster mutation. And in fact, finite dimensional silting modules are studied in this context under the name of support tau tilting modules and play an important role in the study of cluster mutation, something related to Lie algebras and so on. Yeah, now let's come back to our problem. So again, we want to understand universal localizations, the relationship with pseudo-flat ring epimorphisms, and now I introduced silting theory and spoke of silting modules because they are closely related to universal localizations. The point is that when you take a finite dimensional silting module, then you can construct in a quite natural way a universal localization out of it. And it turns out that this universal localization will even be finite dimensional. So the new ring you construct will be again a finite dimensional algebra. And in this way in general you get an injective map. When you have of course to do some identification. You identify silting modules which are isomorphic, of course, but even more, in general, a silting module will be a direct sum of some small building blocks, we call them indecomposable modules, with some multiplicities. There might be some repetition, and now you want to get rid of multiplicities, and then what you get is, we call this a basic silting module. It's in some sense the skeleton of your silting module. Yeah. And so if you get rid of multiplicities and you identify isomorphic modules, then you get really an injective map from silting modules to finite dimensional universal localizations. It's an injection, and sometimes it's a bijection. Let's see when it is a bijection. It's a bijection when your algebra is tau tilting finite. What does this mean? It's a condition on the quantity, the number of modules that you can have. So it says that there are only finitely many basic finite dimensional silting modules up to isomorphism. So essentially there are only finitely many silting modules, the finite dimensional silting modules. Yeah? When you have this, so it says that this set is finite. When this set is finite, then you have a bijection, and this set is of course again finite. Yeah. Okay. Where do these tau tilting finite algebras occur? Let us look at an important example, and it's a very big class of tau tilting finite algebras that we get here. These are the representation finite algebras. So when do we say that an algebra is representation finite? Again, it's a condition on the quantity of modules. So we are asking that there are only finitely many indecomposable finite dimensional modules up to isomorphism. So I told you that modules can be decomposed into indecomposables, and we want that there are only finitely many building blocks. Okay, then of course you can play with them and construct a lot of modules, but the building blocks, there are only finitely many. This is the notion of representation finite algebra. This is a class of algebras that is rather well understood. So if, for example, if the algebra is also hereditary, remember hereditary meant this global dimension 1. In that case, you have a full classification of the representation finite algebras in terms of Dynkin quivers. Dynkin quivers are quivers that occur in Lie theory, for example, and there is a full classification. And in general, you can, I mean, they are rather well understood, and there are, in many cases, there are really complete lists explaining which are the representation finite algebras. Okay, and now there is an important result by Auslander, which connects representation finiteness, so this condition on the quantity of modules, with a condition on the size of modules. It says that if you have only finitely many building blocks, then you have only small modules. You don't have large modules. You can't construct infinite dimensional modules. Of course, you can always construct infinite dimensional modules in a trivial way. You take a finite dimensional one and you take its direct sum, countably many copies of itself, then you will get an infinite dimensional module. But this is a very cheap it's cheating somehow, yeah? But when you have, in this case, in a representation finite case, all indecomposable modules are finite dimensional, yeah, and therefore, whatever you build up to this trick of repeating the same module countably many times or infinitely many times, besides from this is the only possibility of constructing infinite dimensional modules. So, as I said, it's a condition that links quantity, the fact that there are only finitely many finite dimensional modules, with size. There are only small modules. Okay, this was a very important result in the 70s by Auslander. And now let me show you an analog for tau tilting finite. So now again, we link quantity with size. So we show that if the algebra is tau tilting finite, so there are only finitely many finite dimensional silting modules, then the silting modules are all small, are all finite dimensional, up to some identification. But okay, same problem as before. Of course, you can take a silting module and you take countably many copies of it, and then you get a large one. But that's the only thing that you can do. Okay, so again, quantity and size are the same, it's equivalent. And now, if we go back, remember that we had that for tau tilting finite algebras, we have this bijection. Then, of course, on one thing is easy. If you have finitely many modules here, you have finitely many universal localizations here. But the converse is also true. So the tau tilting finiteness is equivalent to the condition that there are only finitely many pseudo-flat ring epimorphisms starting in A. And then one can also show, and now I can come back to the original question, that pseudo-flat ring epimorphisms are all universal localizations, and they are all finite dimensional. So this is again a case where pseudo-flat and universal localization is the same. And what we don't know, and that's how I close my talk now, open question is we don't know whether this condition is equivalent to the others, whether we can go back. So we don't know exactly what it means for a finite dimensional algebra. The condition that all pseudo-flat ring epimorphisms are finite dimensional, we don't know whether it's equivalent to tau tilting finite or not. I start to believe that it is not, but I can't really describe these algebras. And this is, by the way, it's related to a question in invariant theory, in geometric representation theory. Okay, I think I will finish here. Thank you very much. Sí.
Primero, o sea, muchas gracias. Hice la parte de tilting y últimamente me interesaba mucho. Pero una primera pregunta, ¿ese morfismo pseudoplano?
Sí.
Pseudoflat o de universal localization, ¿tiene alguna interpretación en la categoría de morfismos de anillos? O sea, viendo como un A2, representación de la categoría de representación de Kuiper, pero sobre Sí, o sea, los morfismos, localizaciones universales corresponden a un morfismo entre anillos, ¿no? Lo podemos ver como subclase de representaciones de Kuiper de A2 evaluado en la categoría de anillos.
Sí.
Sí, ¿no? Y ahí eso, o sea, ese universal localization tiene alguna interpretación categóricamente.
Pseudo flat, no lo sé. No lo sé, nunca he pensado en esto, no lo sé.
Yeah, bueno.
Sí.
Y otra cosa también de pseudoflats. Pseudoflats son, de alguna forma son perpendiculares, pero según el funtor Tor, ¿no?
Sí.
Sí. Entonces, por ejemplo, podría decir, porque si tenemos, por ejemplo, ese está a la derecha, perpendicular a la derecha según Tor, ¿no?
Sí, Tor 1, solo Tor 1 con S y S.
Ese está en su, como R módulo.
¿Cómo?
Como R módulo.
Como R módulo,
Sí.
como R módulo. Sí.
Exacto, entonces eso produce un par de contortion.
Con respecto a Tor.
Sí,
podría ser.
entonces yo me preguntaba si con respecto al... No, desde Tor pasar al ext. Par de contortion.
Sí, lo que
cada
se
par
sabe...
de Tor es cada par según el funtor Tor, lo que sepa algo da...
Sí, lo que se sabe es que si tú tienes un epimorfismo pseudoplano, entonces sabes que calcular x1, pero solo x1, sobre R o sobre S es la misma cosa.
Sí, no, por el R.
Esta
sí,
es la conexión con ext. Pero...
Sí, todo R, pero mi pregunta era si podría decir, por ejemplo, dual de S según R, ¿y sería cotilting o no?
Pero yo tampoco sé si S es tilting.
No tilting, no, pero su dual,
no creo que no.
No, vale.
No, en general, ahora entiendo lo que... Porque sí, claro, si empezamos, por ejemplo...
Dual, pero su dual, sí, que su dual me refiero carácter dual.
Creo que ahora he entendido la pregunta. Entonces, si empezamos con un epimorfismo pseudo-flat, donde sabemos, entonces de R a S, donde sabemos, pongamos que sea inyectivo, donde sabemos que S tiene dimensión proyectiva 1, entonces de ahí podemos construir un módulo tilting. Y hay también una construcción dual, sí, como tú. Pero hay que saber que la dimensión proyectiva es menor o igual de 1. Si no, no creo que haya nada.
Ya. Gracias.
¿Cuál es el paso siguiente en este teorema? Si tienes el resultado para álgebra finito dimensional,
sí.
El paso siguiente, ¿qué sería? Si cuando uno matemática finita uno tiene un conjunto finito, el paso siguiente es tener en algún sentido compacidad o algo así. ¿Qué sería aquí el paso siguiente?
Sí, hay una noción de tilting discrete, que es algo como tau tilting finite, pero en categoría derivada. Vamos a ver los complejos, a poner acotar el número de complejos tilting que hay. Y en hecho, sé que mis coautores han mostrado que tilting discrete es lo mismo, es equivalente, también un resultado de esa forma. Entonces, si tienes tilting discrete, no tienes complejos tilting grandes. El mismo resultado en categoría derivada. Esto quizás es el paso siguiente, no sé. Sí.
Y lo último, esos cocientes que tiene para establecer esta biyección, sí, en el teorema anterior.
¿Aquí? No.
No, en la página anterior. Ahí.
Sí.
Cuando cocientas eso, ahí se pierde mucho. ¿Qué se pierde?
No se pierde nada. Es lo que decía antes, que vais identificando aquí los epimorfismos que te dan la misma categoría bireflectiva. Y esto quiere solo decir que factorizas uno con el otro por un isomorfismo de anillos. Entonces, esencialmente es el mismo. Es solo, sí, es muy inocente.